Hello, my name is Stanford Gibson. I am the sediment transport specialist on the RAS team, and today I'm going to talk about variable time steps in HEC-RAS. There are kind of two reasons you would want a variable time step. You could want time step to vary in time, or you could be in a situation where it's appropriate for your time step to vary in space. So for example, you could want your time step to vary over the course of your simulation. This is where your time step will vary in time. So time delta t is a function of time. Not really though, like delta t is actually a function of the velocity of the flow or the courant condition. But there are other cases in which you're going to want your delta t to be a function of your delta x. Essentially, you're going to want your time step to be different in different places of the model, even at the same time step. So if you've got large cross-section spacings in your 1D model and then different variable like cell spacings in your 2D models, you would want different time steps in those different areas at the kind of same time of your model. There are two different approaches for doing these two different things in RAS. If you want your time step to vary with time, we call that variable or adaptive time step, which is a courant condition type analysis, which will automatically vary your time series over time. And if you want different time steps in different spatial regions of your model, we call that time slicing. It's a totally different thing, but kind of a similar idea. And so in this video, I'm just going to kind of walk you through each one and show you an example data set. But before you start using an adaptive time step or time slicing, you kind of want to start with a good base time step. And how do you come up with a good base time step? Well, one of the biggest problems we see in unsteady RAS models, both one-dimensional and two-dimensional, is people just choose a base time step that's way too large. And so you want to compute what's the appropriate base time step. And so that we're going to do that here. That's the computation interval. We're going to choose a time step of 6 minutes for this model. Now, where did I come up with 6 minutes? Did I just pull it out of the air? No, you compute the base time step with the courant condition. Now, the courant condition can seem like magic or like difficult, but it's actually very easy to compute. You want a courant condition that's usually around 1. For explicit models are courant limited, and so you have to have a courant condition that's 1. HEC-RAS is an implicit model, which means it's like courant suggested. You can often get away with a courant condition of 2 or even 4. But the idea is that you want that courant condition to be between 1 and 2 or in that general area. You don't want courant conditions way larger than 4 or way less than 1. And so you can choose a base time step with the courant condition. And all the courant condition says is if you look at the distance that the water travels in a time step, which is just the velocity of the water times the length of the time step, that length per time times time, so it gives you a length, you want that to scale to the actual size of the control volume, whether that's the distance between the cross sections or the length of the 2D cell. And so to compute your time step, you just rearrange that, and the time step is the length of the 2D cell or the distance between the cross sections divided by the velocity. How do you come up with the velocity? Well, at first you kind of have an intuitive sense. 2 to 3 feet per second is not a bad place to start with most systems, as long as they're not supercritical flow. And then you can actually get a first runoff, go and look what the actual velocity is, and update this. And so the idea here is that I know that my cross sections, my minimum cross section spacing in this model, it's a big model, big river, is about 1,000 feet. Let's set the courant condition to 1 for this initial calculation. And I've got an average velocity of around 2 feet per second. Is it exactly that? Nah, but we can come back and update that later. So that comes out to a time step of 500 seconds or 8 minutes. Again, I said this is a really big model. 8 minutes is much longer than you'd use for most systems, but it's appropriate here. And so I come to my model, and I look at this and hey, there's no 8 minutes, there's 6 or 10, I'll start with 6. And so that's my base time step. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is how to change your time step in time. And so to do that, we're going to use the adaptive time step or the variable time step. And so the idea here is that you can always push on this little ellipses to get to the 2D options in RAS, or you can go to options, computational options and tolerances. I push the buttons, so let's do that. And the buttons open to the 2D options and tolerances in RAS. And so we've got the general options for 1D and then the 2D flow options, 1D, 2D flow. And then the fourth tab is what we actually care about. It's this advanced time step control. And it'll come in with the fixed time step, or which we call the basic method. You can also go in and adjust the time step kind of manually. You can give it blocks of time where you want to double it or subtract it. If it's not courant driven, we actually put this in particularly for reservoir drawdowns, because a lot of times reservoir drawdowns go unstable at the moment that you kind of reveal the reservoir delta, rather than based on some strict courant condition. but often courant condition actually works pretty well for that too. So mainly what people use is this adjust time step based on courant. I can tell you that on the RAS team, we very rarely do a model without using this tool. If once you get familiar with this, it's kind of hard to imagine doing it any other way. The problem is we give you 5 open boxes here. And if you don't know what to put in these open boxes, you kind of get white space paralysis and get concerned. But it's actually not hard at all. So you've got 5 things you have to put in here. And if you do this, RAS will compute your time step dynamically based on the courant condition. And so it asks kind of what's the maximum courant value you want and what's the minimum. There's only 3 values that I generally put in this maximum courant box, 1, 2, or 4. 1 says, hey, we're actually going to limit water to passing through your smallest control volume in 1 time step. And this is another reason why it's important to have cross sections evenly spaced and not have a lot of cells that are a lot smaller or a lot larger in your 2D mesh. But a lot of times you can relax that, especially in the finite volume code. And so let's go with 2 here. All right, and so then what's the minimum courant condition? What we'll generally do is have the minimum courant condition be just a little bit less than half of the max. So half would be 1 here, but you don't actually want to do 1 because generally what we're going to do is we're going to have or double the time step in response to how things change, which could cause you to oscillate between these 2 courant conditions, higher, lower, double half. And so generally what we'll do is we'll make the minimum courant just a little bit smaller than the maximum. And so here it's going to be 0.95. For a maximum courant of 1, it would be 0.45. You get the idea. All right, then let's skip this 3rd box because it's kind of the most confusing. And let's go to the 4th and 5th because these are pretty easy. This is, what is the maximum number of times you want to double the time step? Well, that means that if you are below the minimum, we're going to double the time step until you get up to the minimum courant condition of 0.95. But at some point, that's just gets absurd and you don't want to do it anymore. And so what's the maximum? And so here I'm going to say, well, 4 times. I want to double the time step 4 times, which with a base time step of 6 minutes gives me a time step of 96 minutes. I'm not sure I ever really want a time step that long, and definitely not more than that. Then the next one is, hey, how many times do you want to have the time step to get down to this 2? If you've got a courant condition of like 6 or 4 or 12, how many times are we going to have the 6 minutes in order to get down to that courant condition of 2, again, at the critical cell or cross section. So it'll probably be the smallest one. And let's just say 4 there as well. And so if you have 6 minutes 4 times, you get down to 22 seconds. Now for some models, especially for really fine 2D models or supercritical models, sometimes you use this to get down to sub-second time steps. Your base time steps a second, but you want to get down to like 0.03 seconds for something really aggressive. You can do that here. All right, so then the last one is, what is the number of steps below the minimum that you want before doubling? Well, what that is going to do is it's going to say, hey, we're going to kind of gradually ease into doubling. We don't want to double every time because you don't want to get into this situation where you're oscillating between doubling and having every couple of time steps. And so this actually gives you a chance to see if it resolves itself to kind of ease into your doubling. And so here I'll just put 4, but 4 to 6, 8 is often good. All right, so there we go. And I'm going to run this model. And what you can see is that the model goes in and it says, hey, okay, that's cool that you wanted to start with a 6-minute time step, but when I'm looking at your courant conditions, both in your 1D and your 2D cells, I'm seeing that that's actually pretty large. And so we want to subdivide it, and we're going to subdivide it, but it doesn't subdivide it all at the first time step. It goes down to 130, then 45 seconds, and then 22 and a half seconds, which is where it stabilizes. And sometimes you'll see this go up and down depending on how your flows change over time, but this is a steady flow, so this is going to equalize there. And so that's how your adaptive time step works. All right, so now we're going to go back and we're going to make that fixed. And the next thing we're going to talk about is, we have cross sections here that are 1,000 to 2,000 feet apart, which this is one of America's largest rivers, so that's actually appropriate. But in this detailed area, we have cells that are more like they're more like 200 feet apart. This is actually a 200-foot cell spacing, and we've got a couple of smaller ones as we've subdivided or put in break lines here. But if we've got cross sections that are 2,000 feet apart and 2D cells that are 200 feet apart, well, they deserve very different time steps based on their Courant condition. I would say 2 in order of 10. You probably want to use a time step in your 2D cells that's about 1/10 of the time step you want to use in your 1D cross sections, because the cross sections are 10 times farther apart. Well, this is where you can use time slicing. If you want your time step to vary spatially and have different time steps for different parts of your model, you can use time slicing as long as part of your model is 2D. And so if you go again to Options, Computation Options and Tolerances, or press the triple buttons, this is under the 2D flow options. And so this is really just one variable here. It's number of time slices. And you can see that you have a default, which is 1. The global default is going to be you're not going to time slice. But then you will get a different column for each of your different 2D areas. In this case, we have only one 2D area, so we only have one option. But if you had 3 or 4 2D areas, maybe with different cell resolutions, you get one for each of these and can define your time slicing individually. And so what I want to do here is I just want to go to my number of time slices and say, hey, I'm using this 6-minute time step for my cross sections, but I want to have 10 time slices in my 2D area because my cells are about 1/10 of the length. My dx will be 1/10 of the dx in the 1D model. And so that's all we'll do. And so we'll go File, Save, and Run. And you don't get any helpful notes for this here, but what's going on is we're actually doing 10 time steps of the 2D mesh for every 1 time step that we do. All right, so this has been a HEC-RAS user's manual video where we talked about how to subdivide your time step either in time with a variable time step or in space with time slicing in HEC-RAS. These can be really helpful to get to a Courant appropriate time step in different parts of your model or different periods of your model. These features were developed by the RAS team, and this video was funded by Corps of Engineers set funds.